Little MAGA girl was denied treatment by leftist nurse, but a WWII veteran rushed in and did something that froze her in her tracks. Subscribe to the channel right now to find out the end of this epic story and comment below which part of this great America you are watching from. The sterile corridors of Memorial Hospital felt colder than usual on that grey Tuesday afternoon. It was a chill that seemed to seep from the very walls, penetrating far beyond the skin, freezing the soul of anyone seeking solace and healing in that place. For Barbie, a girl of only 14, that antiseptic environment was about to transform into the stage of a nightmare she could never have imagined living in her own country. Barbie was not your average teenager lost in the digital void of social media trends. She was a real little MAGA girl, raised in a home where love for the flag, respect for history, and an unwavering belief in freedom were not just loose words, but the pillars of her existence. She had been taught that the hospital was a place of safety, a sanctuary where doctors and nurses were guardian angels sworn to protect life. But today, fragilized by a sudden burning fever and an acute abdominal pain that left her hunched over in her plastic chair, she felt a strange hostility in the air. Draped over her trembling shoulders, like a sacred mantle of protection, was the flag of the United States. It was her comfort blanket, a symbol of the strength she was currently lacking physically. Beneath the stars and stripes, she wore her favorite red t-shirt with pride, the white letters stamped across the chest, defining her family's hope. MAGA. To Barbie, it meant prosperity, safety, and a future where America came first. She did not know, however, that these innocent symbols of patriotism would serve as a trigger for the hatred of an ideology that tolerates no divergence. The waiting room was nearly empty, save for the constant, maddening hum of fluorescent lights that flickered intermittently, creating an atmosphere of psychological tension. Barbie shivered, her teeth chattering not just from the fever, but from the vulnerability of being alone. Her mother was still outside, struggling to find a parking spot in the crowded lot, leaving Barbie to face the initial intake process by herself. She clutched her stomach, her knuckles white, her eyes squeezed shut as a wave of nausea rolled over her. She just wanted someone to help. She just wanted the pain to stop. Then, the door to the triage area swung open with abrupt mechanical force. It wasn't a smiling, compassionate doctor who appeared. It was Nurse Brenda. Brenda was the personification of radical left activism infiltrated into institutions that were meant to be neutral. Her presence commanded the room, not with warmth, but with a rigid, icy severity. Her hair was pulled back tightly, straining against her scalp, and her pristine white uniform was unblemished, adorned only by a small but conspicuously placed pin on her left pocket, a rainbow flag intertwined with a clenched fist. She exuded authority, but not the authority of a caretaker. It was the authority of a judge. Brenda held a clipboard against her chest like a shield. She scanned the empty room, looking for the next name on her list. "Next patient," she announced, her voice flat and devoid of empathy. Barbie forced her eyes open. Through the haze of her pain, she saw the nurse and felt a flicker of hope. "Here," Barbie whispered, her voice cracking. She tried to stand, using the armrest to hoist herself up, adjusting the American flag that was slipping from her shoulders. As Barbie moved, the motion caught Brenda's eye. The nurse's gaze didn't land on the girl's pale, sweaty face. It didn't register the tears of pain welling in the child's eyes, or the way she held her abdomen in distress. Brenda's eyes locked instantly, with a laser-like intensity that bordered on visceral disgust, onto the red shirt and the white block letters. MAGA. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. It was a silence charged with a silent judgment that screamed louder than any siren. Barbie, innocent and desperate for relief, looked up at the woman, expecting to be beckoned into the exam room. Instead, she was met with an audible, theatrical sigh of contempt. Brenda lowered the clipboard slowly, her lip curling into a sneer. The nurse planted her feet firmly, crossing her arms over her chest, effectively blocking the entrance to the hallway like a guardian of an ideological gate. She refused to take the step necessary to begin care. In that split second, the atmosphere shifted instantly from a place of healing to a cultural battlefield. Barbie froze, confused. She took a tentative step forward, her sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. "Mom, I think I have a fever," Barbie stammered, her southern accent trembling. Brenda didn't move. She didn't blink. She simply stared at the 14-year-old girl as if she were looking at a monster rather than a sick child. The nurse's eyes swept over the American flag draped around Barbie, and the disgust on her face deepened. "We don't have time for political stunts here," Brenda finally spoke, her voice echoing through the empty waiting room with a cutting sharpness. It wasn't a medical inquiry, it was an accusation. Barbie blinked, the heat of her fever making it hard to process the words. "Stunt? No, ma'am, I'm not playing. It hurts," Barbie murmured, clutching her side. "My mom is parking the car, please." But compassion was not on the agenda for the leftist activist that day. To Brenda, this wasn't a patient named Barbie. This was a symbol of everything she despised. This was a living representation of the Trump movement she believed was the root of all societal evil. The fact that it was a child made no difference to her. In her worldview, there were no innocents on the other side, only accomplices. Brenda took a step forward, invading the girl's personal space, the sterile smell of the hospital mixed with the palpable aura of animosity. "You think you can walk in here, wrapped in that symbol of oppression, and demand privileges?" Brenda asked, her voice rising, losing its professional cadence and adopting the tone of a lecturer. Barbie felt small. She felt the walls closing in. She looked around for help, for her mother, for anyone, but the room was empty. She was trapped in the gaze of a woman who saw her existence as an affront. The pain in her stomach flared again, sharp and twisting, but the fear in her heart was starting to eclipse it. She realized with a terrifying clarity that the person supposed to save her was looking at her like an enemy. "I just want a doctor," Barbie whimpered, a tear finally escaping and rolling down her fever-flushed cheek. Brenda's expression didn't soften. If anything, the sight of the little MAGA girl crying seemed to embolden her. The nurse stood tall, blocking the path to medicine, blocking the path to relief, her eyes burning with a self-righteous fury that was just beginning to ignite. Barbie was alone, sick, and suddenly very afraid. "Senora, I'm not playing. It hurts so much," Barbie murmured, her voice failing, cracking under the dual pressure of physical agony and sudden, inexplicable hostility. She tried to take another step, her sneakers dragging on the linoleum, her small hand reaching out instinctively for support. But the support she sought was denied. Brenda did not offer a steadying arm. Instead, she took a sharp step forward, invading the 14-year-old's personal space with aggressive intent. Her finger, manicured and rigid, rose like a weapon, pointing accusingly at the girl's chest, specifically at the white letters that spelled out MAGA. "You don't get to play the victim here," Brenda hissed, her voice dripping with a venomous calm that was more terrifying than a scream. "Not while you wear that hate speech on your chest. You think because you're a child you get a pass? Ignorance is no excuse for perpetuating oppression." Barbie recoiled as if slapped. The hallway, though empty of other patients, felt like it was crowding in on her. The hum of the ventilation system seemed to roar in her ears. It's just a shirt," she sobbed, clutching her stomach as a fresh wave of cramping bent her double. "My daddy gave it to me. We love our country." "Love your country?" Brenda laughed, a harsh, brittle sound devoid of mirth. The nurse looked around the empty corridor, as if performing for an invisible audience of like-minded activists. That is not love, little girl. That is nationalism. That is a dog whistle for everything wrong with this society. You are walking into a place of science and healing, wrapped in a flag that to many of us represents exclusion and pain. The escalation was rapid and brutal. Brenda was no longer a triage nurse assessing a sick child. She had transformed into a gatekeeper of morality, a prosecutor in a kangaroo court where Barbie had already been found guilty. The nurse began to pace back and forth in front of the double doors leading to the examination rooms, effectively creating a human barricade. "You want treatment?" Brenda stopped pacing and crossed her arms, tilting her head with a look of supreme condescension. "Then you need to understand that this hospital is a safe space. And your attire, it makes it unsafe. It triggers trauma. How do you think a marginalized person would feel seeing you parade around in that?" Barbie was crying openly now, big hot tears tracking through the sweat on her face. She didn't understand the words Brenda was using: marginalized, trigger, dog whistle. She only understood that she was sick, she was scared, and the lady in the white uniform hated her. "I just want the doctor," Barbie wailed, a high-pitched cry of pure desperation. She tried to move around the nurse, a clumsy, pain-riddled attempt to bypass the blockade. Brenda moved with surprising speed, blocking the path again. She didn't touch Barbie, but she loomed over her, using her height and authority to intimidate. "We don't serve fascists in training here," she spat, the word fascist landing like a stone. "This facility serves the community, the inclusive community, not people who worship billionaires and want to turn the clock back to the 1950s. The cruelty of the situation was palpable. Here was a professional, bound by oath to do no harm, inflicting deep psychological wounds on a minor because of a political disagreement. Brenda's face was contorted, the mask of professional detachment completely gone, replaced by the fervor of the radical left. She was fueled by a self-righteous fury, convinced that by denying this girl, she was somehow fighting the system. "You need to take it off," Brenda commanded, pointing at the red shirt. "And that flag, remove those symbols of aggression, and maybe, I'll see if there's a doctor available who is willing to tolerate you. Until then, you can sit there and think about the consequences of your ideology." Barbie gasped, clutching the flag tighter around her shoulders. It was her shield. Removing it felt like surrendering, like admitting she had done something wrong when she knew in her heart she hadn't. "No!" she cried, her voice trembling but defiant. "I won't! It's the American flag! It's for everyone! Why are you being so mean?" "Mean?" Brenda's eyes widened, and her voice rose to a shout, echoing off the cold tiles. "I am educating you. Someone has to break this cycle of toxic patriotism you've been brainwashed with. You cry about pain. What about the pain your politics caused to the planet, to society?" Barbie's knees finally gave way. The physical pain in her abdomen, combined with the crushing weight of the verbal assault, was too much. She collapsed onto the hard floor, curling into a ball, the stars and stripes draping over her like a fallen soldier. She was a tiny island of red, white, and blue in a sea of sterile grey. "Get up!" Brenda snapped, looking down at the weeping child with disdain. "Stop the theatrics! This performative fragility won't work on me. I know your type. You think you can cry and get what you want." Barbie couldn't stop. The sobbing was convulsive now, shaking her small frame. She felt completely abandoned. The hospital, which was supposed to be a place of help, had become a prison of ideology. She felt the heavy gaze of the nurse boring into her, stripping away her dignity layer by layer. "Please," Barbie whispered into the floor, her voice barely audible. "Mama," Brenda sneered, checking her watch, as if this emotional destruction was wasting her valuable time. "Your mother isn't here to protect you from the truth," she said coldly. "And the truth is, until you learn some respect for diversity and shed those hateful rags, you are not a priority. You are a problem." The nurse turned her back on the girl, walking a few feet away to a desk. Effectively dismissing Barbie's existence, she began typing on a computer, ignoring the whimpering heap on the floor. Ideally, a nurse would be rushing to check vitals, to comfort, to heal. But Brenda sat there, satisfied in her twisted sense of justice, believing she had struck a blow against the MAGA enemy. Barbie lay there, the cold of the floor seeping into her bones, mixing with the fire in her belly. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying for an angel, for a miracle, for anyone to save her from this nightmare. She felt small, erased, and terrified that she might die right there on the floor, unnoticed and unloved by the very people paid to save her. The despair was absolute. The silence that returned to the hallway was broken only by Barbie's ragged breathing and the distant rhythmic clicking of the nurse's keyboard, the sound of bureaucracy indifference. The radical left had drawn its line in the sand, and a sick 14-year-old girl was the casualty. But the corridor was not as empty as Brenda thought. At the far end of the hall, where the shadows of the afternoon lengthened, a rhythmic tapping sound began. Tap, step, tap, step. It was a sound of iron and will, a sound of history approaching. The rhythmic tapping grew louder, a metronome of approaching judgment cutting through the sterile silence of the hospital corridor. Clack, thud, clack, thud. It was not the hurried scuff of sneakers or the squeak of medical clogs. It was the heavy, deliberate sound of a cane striking the floor with the force of a gavel, accompanied by the solid bootfall of a man who had marched through hell and refused to stay there. From the dim end of the hallway, where the shadows of the afternoon sun stretched long and thin, Colonel James Iron Miller emerged. He was 92 years old, his skin weathered like old parchment and mapped with the lines of a century of history. But his spine was as rigid as the steel of the tanks he once commanded. Today, of all days, he had donned his full-dress uniform for a memorial service he had attended earlier, an olive-drab jacket heavy with the brass and ribbons of the greatest generation. On his chest sat the Silver Star, the Purple Heart, and campaign ribbons that traced a path of blood from the beaches of Normandy to the frozen forests of the Ardennes. Colonel Miller had come to the hospital for a routine check on his pacemaker, but his old ears, attuned to the frequencies of distress and combat, had picked up the sound of weeping. He had heard the sharp, barking tone of a bully. It was a tone he recognized. It was the same tone he had heard shouting orders in German across icy battlefields. It was the universal sound of tyranny. As he rounded the corner, the scene before him struck him with the force of a physical blow. He saw the girl, little Barbie, crumpled on the floor, a small heap of sobbing humanity wrapped in the stars and stripes. And standing over her, back turned to the suffering child, was Nurse Brenda, typing away with a smug indifference that boiled the old soldier's blood. "Get away from that child!" The command didn't come from an old man. It came from an officer. Miller's voice, though aged, possessed a resonant, gravelly depth that seemed to shake the fluorescent lights overhead. It was a voice that had ordered men to fix bayonets when all hope was lost. Brenda jumped, her hands flying off the keyboard. She spun around in her swivel chair, her expression shifting from boredom to shock as she took in the figure barreling toward her. The colonel was moving with a speed that defied his years, ignoring the agony in his bad knee. His cane now lifted slightly off the ground, not as a support, but as an extension of his will. "Excuse me?" Brenda sputtered, standing up instinctively, her face flushing. "You can't shout in here. This is a quiet zone. And who do you think you are, barging in?" "I said step away!" Miller roared, closing the distance. He didn't stop until he had placed himself directly between the nurse's station and the girl on the floor. He planted his cane firmly on the linoleum with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. He turned his head briefly to check on Barbie, his eyes softening for a fraction of a second before snapping back to the nurse with the intensity of a targeting laser. Brenda, recovering her wits, straightened her uniform and narrowed her eyes. She saw the uniform, the medals, and the grey buzz cut, and her lip curled. To her, he wasn't a hero. He was a relic of the patriarchy, a living symbol of the imperialist history she loathed. "Sir," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "you are disrupting a medical triage. I'm handling a situation with a non-compliant individual who refuses to adhere to our community standards of inclusivity, and frankly, your aggressive stance and that costume are creating a hostile environment." Costume? The word hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. Miller drew himself up to his full height, towering over the nurse despite her high-soled shoes. "Young woman, this is not a costume. This is the uniform of the United States Army. I wore this when I watched my friends die in the mud so that you could have the freedom to stand there and spout your nonsense. And that girl," he pointed a trembling finger at Barbie, "is wearing the flag we draped over their coffins. That flag is a symbol of hate in this context," Brenda shouted back, losing her composure, her ideological programming kicking in to defend her cruelty. "She is wearing a MAGA shirt. She is promoting division. I will not treat a fascist sympathizer while she flaunts her intolerance in my face. I have the right to refuse service to anyone who threatens my mental safety." "Your mental safety?" Miller stepped closer, invading her bubble, forcing her to take a step back against the desk. "You are refusing treatment to a sick American child because of her political beliefs. Is that what this country has come to? I fought the Nazis, lady. I saw what happens when people start deciding who gets to live and who gets to die based on the color of their shirt or the symbol on their arm. You think you're progressive. You're acting exactly like the brown shirts we crushed in '45. The hallway had gone deathly silent. A few other staff members poked their heads out of doors, and a doctor paused down the hall, watching with wide eyes. Brenda felt the walls closing in. She was losing the moral high ground, and she knew it. The sheer weight of the veteran's presence was suffocating her arguments. She looked at his medals gleaming under the lights, undeniable proof of sacrifice she could never match. You don't understand," Brenda stammered, her voice shrill. "It's about equity. It's about dismantling systems of—" "It is about a little girl in pain," Miller barked, cutting through her buzzwords like a machete through vines. "Look at her. She is terrified. She is sick. And you are lecturing her on sociology? Shame on you. Shame on this hospital." Miller turned his back on the nurse, dismissing her as a threat, effectively stripping her of her power. He knelt down beside Barbie. The groan of his joints was audible, a testament to the pain he was willing to endure for her. "Brenda," the colonel said over his shoulder, his voice low and deadly calm now, "if you do not get a doctor here in 30 seconds, I will bring the fury of every veteran organization in this state down on this building. I will have news crews here before the sun sets. I will make sure the world knows that Memorial Hospital leaves children to rot on the floor because they love their president." Brenda turned pale. The threat of public exposure, the fear of the cancel culture turning against her, finally pierced her armor of self-righteousness. She looked around, realizing she was alone in her crusade. The doctor down the hall was already hurrying over, looking apologetic. I'll report this," Brenda hissed, grabbing her clipboard, her hands shaking with rage and humiliation. "You can't intimidate staff. I'll file a grievance. You and this brat will be banned. The system will hear about this aggression." "Go ahead," Miller said without looking back. "Tell them Iron Miller sent you." Brenda fled. She didn't walk. She retreated, storming through the double doors toward the administrative offices. muttering threats of lawsuits and systemic racism, her defeat absolute yet unaccepted in her own mind. The leftist threat had been neutralized, at least for the moment. The immediate danger was gone. The colonel turned his full attention to the sobbing girl. "It's all right now, soldier," Miller whispered, his voice transforming from thunder to a gentle breeze. He reached out a large, calloused hand and rested it gently on Barbie's shoulder, right over a white star on the blue field of her flag. "The enemy has retreated. You're safe." Barbie looked up, her eyes red and puffy, seeing the blurry outline of the old man. She saw the medals. She saw the kindness in his weathered face. She didn't see a stranger. She saw a grandfather, a protector. She said, I was bad." Barbie choked out between sobs. "She said my flag was hate." "She was wrong," Miller said firmly, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a pristine white handkerchief. He dabbed her tears. "This flag is love, honey. It's the only thing that keeps the darkness away. And you," he tapped the MAGA letters on her shirt, "you have the courage of a lion to wear that in a place like this. Never let them take that from you." The doctor arrived then, a young man who looked horrified by what he had witnessed from afar. "I'm so sorry," the doctor said, kneeling on the other side. "I didn't know." "Brenda, she can be extreme. Let's get you up, young lady." Miller helped the doctor lift Barbie. As she stood, her legs wobbly, she leaned heavily against the colonel. He took her weight without flinching, standing as a sturdy pillar of traditional strength. "We got you," Miller assured her, but as he looked toward the doors where Brenda had vanished, his eyes narrowed. He knew the battle was won, but the war wasn't over. People like Brenda didn't stop. They maneuvered. They used the system. He tightened his grip on his cane. He would stay until he was sure she was safe. He would stand guard. The transition from the cold, hostile hallway to the private examination room felt like stepping from a storm into a sanctuary. But the true warmth in the room didn't come from the heating vents. It radiated from the silent, stoic presence of Colonel Iron Miller. He refused to sit in the comfortable visitor's chair. Instead, he stood at parade rest near the door, his cane held before him like a sword in its scabbard, watching the medical staff with the sharp, assessing eyes of a commander, ensuring his troops were finally doing their duty. Dr. Evans, the young physician who had intervened, worked with a nervous efficiency, treating Barbie with an exaggerated gentleness that served as a silent apology for his colleague's earlier cruelty. He checked her vitals, administered medication for the pain and fever, and spoke to her in soft, reassuring tones. But every time the doctor looked up, his eyes darted to the old veteran standing guard. The message was clear. The hospital was on notice. The line had been drawn. "You're going to be just fine, Barbie," Dr. Evans said, offering a genuine smile as the color began to return to the girl's cheeks. "It's a nasty viral infection, but we caught it. You're strong. You'll bounce back in no time." Barbie nodded, clutching the edges of her American flag, which she had refused to take off. It was no longer just a piece of fabric to her, it was her armor. She looked past the doctor to the old man in the uniform. "Is he staying?" she asked softly. Miller stepped forward, the medals on his chest chiming softly. "I'm not going anywhere until your squad arrives, soldier," he said, his voice a low rumble of comfort. "We don't leave people behind." As if on cue, the door burst open. Barbie's mother rushed in, eyes wide with panic that instantly melted into relief when she saw her daughter sitting up. The reunion was tearful and loud, a display of raw, unfiltered family love that stood in stark contrast to the sterile, intellectualized coldness of Nurse Brenda. As the mother hugged her child, rocking her back and forth, Miller watched with a satisfied nod. This was what he had fought for, not for policies, not for bureaucracy, but for this, the sacred bond of the American family. When the emotion settled, Barbie's mother turned to the stranger in the dress uniform. She had heard the whispers in the hallway, the rumors of a confrontation. She saw the tear-stained face of her daughter and the fierce pride in the old man's stance. "They told me," the mother began, wiping her eyes, "they told me a nurse refused to help her, that she yelled at her, and that you stopped it." Miller waved a hand dismissively, though his posture remained upright. "I simply reminded the staff of their oath, ma'am. There are people in this country today who have forgotten that we are all Americans first. They let their politics poison their hearts, but we don't let that poison win. Not on my watch." The director of the hospital entered the room moments later, looking pale and shaken. He carried an air of desperate damage control. He approached the family and the colonel with his head bowed. "I want to offer my deepest, most sincere apologies," the director said, his voice trembling slightly under Miller's glare. "Nurse Brenda's behavior was reprehensible. It does not reflect our values. I want you to know that as of 5 minutes ago, she has been relieved of her duties pending a termination hearing. She will not be stepping foot near patients again." Justice had been swift. The threat of the colonel's voice and the thousands of patriots he represented had cut through the red tape faster than any lawsuit could. Barbie sat up straighter. The monster wasn't under the bed. The monster had been fired. She looked at her MAGA shirt, then at the colonel. She realized that she didn't have to hide. She didn't have to be ashamed. "Thank you," Barbie said, her voice small but steady. Miller walked over to the bedside, his limp pronounced, but his dignity unassailable. He looked down at the 14-year-old girl who had endured the hatred of the radical leftist and come out the other side with her spirit intact. He saw in her the future of the Republic, a generation that would need to be tougher, braver, and more resilient than ever before. "Barbie," the colonel said, reaching up to his lapel. His gnarled fingers worked a small clasp. "You faced a bully today, and bullies are all the same, whether they wear swastikas or rainbow pins. They want you to be afraid. They want you to be silent. They want you to take off that shirt and fold up that flag." He pulled a small golden object from his uniform. It was an eagle pin, its wings spread in flight, clutching arrows and an olive branch. It was old, the gold dull from decades of wear, a talisman he had carried since 1945. "I wore this when I came home," Miller said, his voice thickening with emotion. "I wore it when I built my house, when I raised my kids, and when I buried my wife. It reminded me that freedom soars above the muck of the world. I want you to have it." Barbie gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Sir, I can't. It's yours." "It's yours now," Miller insisted, pinning it carefully onto the white stripe of the flag draped over her shoulder, right next to the red MAGA letters. "You earned it. You held the line. Wear it and remember, when they scream, you smile. When they hate, you love. And when they try to tear this country down, you stand up and build it back." Barbie touched the cold metal of the eagle, feeling a surge of electricity run through her. It was a passing of the torch, from the greatest generation to the newest one. The bond was sealed. As they left the hospital an hour later, the sun had broken through the grey clouds, bathing the parking lot in a golden, late-afternoon light. The automatic doors slid open, and Barbie stepped out, not as a victim, but as a victor. The air smelled fresh, free of the antiseptic stench of judgment. Colonel Miller walked them to their car. He didn't say much more. He didn't have to. He stopped at the curb, leaning on his cane, and snapped a crisp, slow salute to the little girl in the red shirt. Barbie, standing by the open car door, straightened her back. She didn't know the proper form, but she mimicked him, her hand touching her brow, her face serious and proud. The flag on her shoulders caught the wind, billowing out behind her like a superhero's cape. As the car drove away, Barbie watched the old soldier through the rear window. He stood there, a lone sentinel against the fading light, guarding the values that made the nation great. She looked down at the golden eagle on her chest. The nurse's hateful words were already fading from her memory, drowned out by the thunder of the colonel's kindness. She knew now that she wasn't alone. She knew that the spirit of America wasn't dead. It was just waiting for people brave enough to wear it on their chest. Barbie smiled, wiped the last tear from her cheek, and looked forward to the road ahead. The radical left had tried to break her, but they had only succeeded in forging her into something stronger, a true patriot. The star-spangled banner waved in her heart, and nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever tear it down.